Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody else at the service as well. My name is Brian. I'm an alcoholic. And yeah, thanks for reminding everyone about the questions bit at the end, Chris. I kind of enjoy that bit the most. Um, I guess it's not a test to see if everybody was listening, but I guess it just shows that suppose I try to explain this information from the literature as best I can. But of course, the best thing to do is actually read the literature and gain the understanding. And whenever the questions come afterwards, it just shows how difficult it is to explain in the absence of the literature. And, to go through one piece of literature in relation to the traditions slowly, bit by bit, might be an idea for the future, because maybe that would explain it with a greater depth of detail. But in the meantime, keep asking questions, and I'll certainly answer them the best I can. I'll try to answer them from the literature if I can, of course. And maybe that's one of the things that landed us in this problem in the first place. The willingness and the desire to be experts on this subject, or any other subject for that matter. And it's often been said that the ego sometimes goes a wee bit wonky for alcoholics. You probably no experience of that, Chris. And those who suggest that I would drift into that territory, damn you! I deny those allegations, Your Honour. But there's certainly grounds for to suggest that if I was to peddle some of my own ideas rather than the ideas of Alcoholics Anonymous, I would probably have a huge amount of fun, but we just end up with a big cluster of chaos. And that's not for to say that the Alcoholics Anonymous traditions are the best ideas ever in the world. But it's just to have some level of consistency. Isn't that where we're going? And I think that if we drift into cult-like thinking of you simply must do what it says within the literature, and if you don't, I don't know, we'll cut you off by the knees and murder your children or something, then, that's not what this is about. This is the borrowing of ancient principles reworded in such a fashion that it would make sense, and let's all agree to use those as guidelines. And otherwise, if we don't have some kind of a benchmark, we're just going to be just banging all over the place. And my friend Laws is going to be talking about his version, what way we should do things. Lisa is going to be coming up with her idea. God knows what Denise McIver is going to come up with. And we're all just going to be living in this world of extreme chaos. And each of those individuals might have perfectly good ideas, but we're only here to serve new people. Isn't that an interesting point that perhaps we don't talk about enough? I would love nothing more than to debate anything. And I'll probably debate in favour of whatever's the weakest argument at the time, because that's good crack, not because I actually want to make a point that I find interesting. I just enjoy the debate. But we're not here to debate. What we're here to do is to relay our individual experience of how we worked through the 12-step program, so that I didn't die, which is great news, and I recovered, and I no longer have the burden of alcohol. My life got better, and I did that by working the 12 steps. And this is how I worked the 12 steps. Now, my story might be different to yours, Roseanne, might be different to yours, Paul, might be different to yours, Lisa, but the literature that we use was the same. The essential methodology, although it might have a different accent and a slightly different personality depending on who delivered it, is the same, because that's what Alcoholics Anonymous is. And we extend that further to our groups, and what we then have is, well, it's not a franchise model. And I know I sometimes use the McDonald's example in this workshop really to exaggerate a point to make a point. It's not a franchise model as such, but what we're talking about is some level of consistency, so that whenever the new person walks into your group in Mayo or your group in London or wherever the frig it is, that they're going to get Alcoholics Anonymous. And the interesting thing tonight that we're going to talk about is the different flavour that could be attached to that substance, or the different accent with which it could be conveyed or whatever. And I'll expand on that shortly whenever we get to that point. But I guess, I've said this before, but the 12 traditions are really just to protect you from me. And I'm not so arrogant as to think that I am the big looming threat in Alcoholics Anonymous, but certainly people like me. And I think that probably each and every one of us have the capability of having our own opinions. Isn't that true? Isn't that a wonderful thing? Isn't it great that we each have our own opinions? And I hope we continue to have our own opinions, and we have our own experience that help us to grow as individuals, help us to grow as a fellowship and an organization, and help us to be more relevant to more people. Chris, I know that you've had some experiences in terms of how you got sober that I didn't have, and I've had some that you didn't have. My dear friend Amy's had the most extraordinary experiences as of recently that I haven't had. So like, we're each able to help people in different ways because of our own experiences, but they're not opinions as such. And you might have some opinions as to the speed with which you read through the book Alcoholics Anonymous. That might be different to mine, all of which are welcome, but the point is there's consistency. And I say all that just as a reminder, and we like to go into a reminder, don't we, for to talk about why the 12 traditions exist at all. And it was for that reason. It's for inconsistency. There's this massive lack of consistency that happened as a result of rapid growth within the early fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because what you had at the start was kind of cool, kind of chaotic, a little bit punk. Didn't work, but it kind of worked, where you had a bunch of guys adopting a trial and error type approach to the essentials of the 12 steps. Now, it was the 6 tenets of the Oxford groups, without getting too historical, but anyway, there's an organization existed before us that is something kind of similar in terms of the recovery program. Bill Wilson was involved in that, as was Dr. Bob. They used the essentials of that, expanded those 6 tenets to drop one of them, which was a complete deflation of the ego, expanded the other 5, put in the stuff that Bill Wilson had learned in his rehab with Dr. Silkworth and whatever, and come up with essentially the 12 steps. And so off they went, trying to save the world, trying to rid the world of alcoholism, one drunk at a time, which is the campaign and the mission that I share with those guys. But they didn't have the sort of framework that I have. They didn't have the spine, if you like, to the body of what they're trying to achieve, because they didn't know. So they tried it one way, and one guy's maybe trying it a slightly different way, and they're just trying to figure out how to help drunks. Until ultimately they came together and decided, okay, now what we need to do is we need to put this into one single volume. We need to agree on a way in which we're going to do this. What mistakes have you made? What did you learn? Why don't we put this all together? They did that. They put it into a book. They called the thing Alcoholics Anonymous. Then they had meetings around this book. So the meetings became called Alcoholics Anonymous after the book. So that is the recovery program. So the book sold quite well. The clergy got interested, the press got interested, various entrepreneurs at the time were interested, and all this publicity started to build till ultimately there was a particular newspaper article or magazine article in the Saturday Evening Post that caused this mushrooming effect where, like, boom, you had this handful of guys doing something kind of cool. Next thing you know, AA is this national institution. They're having to move their offices into Lexington Avenue, and there's people turning up at the door wanting for help, and there's people wanting to buy literature. The sales of books are going through the roof, whatever. It's like this fantastic success story. And as somebody in business, I have learned to my detriment that level of success is in fact not that at all. It's an opportunity for failure at a high level. And have you ever heard that term overselling? Are you familiar with that term? It's something that was introduced to me in the early stages of business, because I'm a salesman. I didn't think there was possible to oversell anything. And if you've oversold, you should probably sell some more. But my early ventures in business suffered from this cash flow problem because we'd sold too much. Success wasn't necessarily a good thing, is what I'm trying to say. And that was certainly the experience of Alcoholics Anonymous. But where they suffered mostly was that rapid level of growth brought with it inconsistency. Like, there weren't any real old timers as such. Like, everybody was Well, they're all yearlings or maybe a couple of years in, whatever, because it was the early stages of the fellowship. And there was nobody really holding all of that together because some of these groups were quite some distance apart, and um, they didn't have access to this fantastic technology where we can all just come together. So you would have like a cluster of guys doing it one way over here and somebody else doing it differently over there or whatever. And it was causing problems. And that part in the forward to the second edition, I was going to read it again, but maybe it won't because we kind of touch on it most weeks. But the forward to the second edition is a really good whistle-stop tour of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. If, like me, you can't be arsed reading it all in great detail. But it speaks to this, like, well, are we going to be able to do all? Are we going to be able to work together? What about the money? And what about, whether we get into these little quarrels and schisms break out, whatever? Like, how's that? They were asking those questions because those very things were happening. And after a bit of lobbying from a chap called Earl T, Bill Wilson decided to come up with what he then called the 12 points to secure AA's future. So he codified some ideas that can be laid down to act as a framework, bumpers, guideline. There weren't rules as such. There was nothing strict about them, but they sort of kept us in lane. Martin, there's no opportunity to raise your hand at this meeting, so we'll maybe catch up with you after the meeting. So this framework was put in place to help the guys to become consistent. To what end? In what way consistent, and for what purpose? So let me just open up this little graphic. Where is it? All right, Chris, we'll get better at this one day. And many weeks I've been doing this, and I'm still rubbish at the share thing. Anyway, let me begin. All right, so you guys are familiar with this little graphic now, of course, because you've been here for a few weeks. And
what helps me?
So this graphic has the 12 editions laid out like books on a shelf. Guys, can you stop unmuting, please? We're working on a workshop format at the end of which is an opportunity to ask questions. If you want to ask questions, just text them into the group. So please get with that. And if you can't get with that, we're probably going to ask you to leave. So you'll see that the groups, the 12 traditions, are sort of laid out as if they're like books on a shelf, and they're color coded for the benefit of this graphic. And the reason being is there are different sections and different groups of the 12 traditions. And the first one we looked at was the dark blue one, which is the why do we even have the traditions? Now, we spoke about the history as to how the traditions come about, but the remedy to that problem of inconsistency was unity. And the method by which we achieve unity is by skipping to the far end, tradition 12. So the bookending of these books are 1 and 12. What are we trying to achieve? Unity. How are we trying to achieve that? Through anonymity. It seems odd, doesn't it? Like, why anonymity? Well, so the unity is often misunderstood, because what does that mean? Well, what does it mean to be unified? And certainly I've been at these business meetings, and certainly our own business meeting, where there's substantial debate, where one person's maybe arguing in favor of one interpretation of how the traditions should be applied, and somebody else is arguing another interpretation of how the traditions should be applied. Is that an expression of disunity? Well, all of that misses the point. The point behind tradition 1 is that we are to unify around a common purpose. What is the common purpose, and what is the method by which we unify around that? Well, the common purpose is best described in page 17 of the big book in the recovery program. And certainly if you work through, step 1, you'll be familiar with that, where it talks about this fellowship where there's this commonality, a commonality where Mike B, Irvin, Lisa, Maria H, Margaret, and I, if any of us were to take alcohol into our system in any form, something would happen in both the bodily and mental sense that would make it virtually impossible for us to stop. We have that in common. So is that what we mean by the unity? Well, it says in our book that in itself will never have held us together as we have now joined. And it goes on to say, because we have found a common solution, a way out on which we can absolutely agree. And it says that that is the great news that this book, the book Alcoholics Anonymous, carries. And then it's inviting us to join in brotherly and harmonious action. So the unity that we're talking about here is to unify around the program of recovery, which is to be found in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Doesn't mean we all just get on all the time, whatever, And, if you heard this one, I've heard someone saying quite often, I like everybody in AA. I must be shit at AA then, because I don't know. It's like, it's not about that. It's about having this common purpose. And our friends, the National Association of Stamp Collectors, who may or may not exist, that I refer to every week, if you rocked into there and said, I'm here to talk about my collection of records, they would say, well, you've come to the wrong place, because we talk about collecting stamps. How would one who's never been there know that? Well, that's what they're freaking called. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? Well, we're called Alcoholics Anonymous. So is it okay if we talk about Alcoholics Anonymous? That might seem like an odd question, but the majority of so-called Alcoholics Anonymous meetings that I've attended, and I mean the majority, I don't mean the odd one, have been shit. And what do I mean by shit? What I mean is they're not talking about Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like going to the Stamp Collectors Fellowship where they're talking about tiddlywinks or some shit. It doesn't make any sense. So that is the way in which we were suffering disunity. And I argue we now suffer from disunity is because the lack of consistency around the common purpose is absent more often than not. So that's what we want to achieve. So let's try and remain positive this week. I'm talking to myself. What we're trying to do is to upliftingly talk about, well, we're able to do that, right? Because we're part of a renaissance. We're part of a bunch of people who are looking back to how it should have been done and saying, okay, well, we made a right royal balls of that. Whatever. We're all smart enough to turn that around. Let's do it now. So if you turn up at a Belfast Recovery Group meeting, and I didn't go to them all, but I'm pretty sure if I went to any one of them, that they will be talking about the program of recovery as outlined in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And if somebody wishes to talk about something else, they will be invited to wait to the end of the meeting, at which point they can talk about their problems and all the rest. But you don't go to AA meetings to talk about your problems. You go to AA meetings to help newcomers. Is that okay? Does anybody mind? Well, if you do mind, I don't care, because that's what we're supposed to do. And that's just how it is. And how do we unify around the program of recovery in the context of the 12 traditions? With anonymity. And does that mean the hiding of your name? Well, look at my screen. I'm not hiding my name. Why would I need to hide my name? We're not talking about privacy here. What we're talking about is the spiritual essence of what anonymity means, which is that I do not matter. Now, I've got a far better idea, Roseanne, for Tradition 5. And I'm not saying that just to be sarcastic for the crack. I genuinely have a far better idea. There is nobody in this room has heard me say it. Maybe Chris has heard me say it outside of the meetings. But, I do not talk about my ideas in Alcoholics Anonymous, because whether the good, bad, or indifferent isn't the point. They're inconsistent. And if my job here is to help a newcomer, I want that newcomer to walk into the meeting down the street and also get that same level of consistency. So that's how this works. And that's how it's supposed to work. So we place principles before personalities by making ourselves anonymous, in that we don't really matter. What principles? The principles of Alcoholics Anonymous are more important than my personality, than my ideas, because there's something bigger than me happening here. There's this global fellowship with branding that's accepted elsewhere and everywhere in the world. Let's get behind that. Let's get behind the essence of that and put our own little personal ideas to one side. Now, in private, let's all have our own ideas. Let's enter into debates. I love a debate. If you want to have a conversation about what God means to you, whatever, let's talk about that all day long. That's a wonderful conversation. But whenever we're at the meetings, what we're talking about is, I've got your own understanding, work through the program, it'll all become clear. Can you expand on that? No, that's what it says in the program. So let's just focus on that. So that's what we should be trying to do in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the application of the traditions, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that stage. Now, we also then talked about tradition two, and do a quick reminder of that because it's very, very important for what we're going to talk about tonight. And in tradition two, it talked about the way that authority works in Alcoholics Anonymous, that we do have leaders, we have trusted servants who we put in place. They're put in place for to serve the groups, though. They're not the bosses of the groups, they're servants, but they're there to lead. And within the group, we have the facilities whereby we can hold ourselves accountable. Now, my sponsor, who I simply adore, never tells me what to do, never holds me accountable to his principles. He will remind me of mine, though, and he will remind me of the ones in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the group, it's the exact same. We as a group come up with how we carry the message, and we hold ourselves accountable to that. And there is no authority above that. And then last time we talked about membership. So you have to be an alcoholic, and you have to wish to recover. And if you don't want to do any of those things, by virtue of a right to be wrong, you can still come and join us. But if you want to join us by virtue of a right to be wrong, it's probably the wrong reason to do it. So why don't you just come here if you're an alcoholic and let us help you get sober and then be a member? Would that be a good idea to keep it as simple as that? I think so. All right. Well, tonight we're going to talk about tradition 4. And this will come as a huge shock to you guys. But so far in these meetings every week, I kind of wing it because I don't like to over prepare. And whenever I was getting ready for tradition 4, I started preparing quite a lot because there's a couple of different angles from which you can approach it, because it's actually quite contradictory if misread. And then I looked at it today and thought, no, it looks a bit crap. And then I wrote it down again from the other angle. And then I decided I just need to put my notes to one side and see what happens here, because this is probably the tradition that I've heard misunderstood the most. I think I said that about them all so far, though, haven't I? Maybe. It's certainly one that is often misunderstood. Let's put it that way. I'll read them. So in the short form, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. Short form. Long form, our AA experience has taught us that, with respect to its own affairs, each AA group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. But when its plans concern the welfare of neighbouring groups also, those groups ought to be consulted, and no group, regional committee or individual should ever take action that might greatly affect AA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board, and such issues are common welfare is paramount. All right, so that's often quoted in the short form to read, each group should be autonomous. So that means we can just do whatever the hell we like by virtue of a veto card that we have in Tradition 4. That's what it means, right? And certainly that was my experience, and that's certainly what I was taught if I was to observe those around me whenever I first came into AA. And I think I told you this story at some point before in these previous workshops, but there was a group that the founders of this group, me being one of them, attended before attending this group. I was 6 months sober at the time, or before starting this group rather, and this group in particular was doing all sorts of absurd things, mostly in relation to the money. Like they were giving all the money away to the church rather than sending it through the AA service structure, and they made me the treasurer at 6 months sober. Whether that was a good idea or not, I don't know, but I didn't nick the money, so I guess we got away with it. And but I'd sort of flagged, should we be doing this? Like, this doesn't seem right. Like, I've read a wee bit about Tradition 7. We seem to be giving all the money away. And the response I got was, I hear what you're saying, Brian, but every AA group is autonomous, and we have autonomously decided that this is what we will do. So the response to what I've said there about Tradition 1 is about how we all unify around the big book. I've said that before in workshops, and the response is, well, that may well be Tradition 1, but every AA group is autonomous, and we've decided not to do that. We've decided to sit around on our arses talking bullshit about our problems and patting each other in the arse because we didn't drink today, but we're autonomous, so we can do that. And I just have to say that from the get-go that understanding is completely and utterly erroneous. This very idea that there's a veto card, that there's one of the traditions that is set up to allow us to violate the rest of the traditions. Even whenever I say it like that, it flags out how absurd an idea that actually is. How could that possibly be the case? And how could that possibly be misunderstood in such a way? Well, I guess it's like, I don't know, I guess how can the rest of the traditions be misunderstood to the way in which they have been up to this point? But I suppose if you don't actually read the damn things, and if you don't look at the context and around them, they are going to be misunderstood, aren't they? But it is not the case that tradition 4 is a veto for the rest of the traditions. So what does it mean, though? What does it mean? And there's something I want to read you from, well, do you remember I said at the start that the traditions were launched in a series of Grapevine magazine articles in the 1940s, and the one in relation to Tradition 4 was launched in March 1948. In this version of Language of the Heart, you can find a copy of the article on page 80. And it says, Tradition 4 is a specific application of the general principles already outlined in Tradition 1 and 2. So you cannot talk about Tradition 4 unless it's prefixed with the understanding of Tradition 1 and 2. So whenever I'm at a service meeting or within the service structure and I start talking about Tradition 4 or misquoting it, and it hasn't been framed around Tradition 1 and 2, I'm thinking, okay, this is going to go down a weird corridor or a cul-de-sac from which you can't claw back. And what does it mean for it to be the general principles already outlined in Tradition 1 and 2? Well, let's break them down one by one. So Tradition 1, about how we are to unify around the program of recovery. How do we unify around the program of recovery? We place principles before personalities. We look at the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we focus on that, and we frame that around the big book. So why is it then that I attend other groups that I admire, that do it differently to Belfast Recover Group? Because that's the way that's supposed to be. This is this beautiful gift of autonomy. And I sometimes think of it like, if you imagine a high street, like a row of shops, say maybe 10 shops, but they all sell the exact same thing. Now, I might walk into one that Amy has set up and it's somewhat feminine, and, maybe there's some pink shit all over the place and I'm not really interested in getting in there because it doesn't feel right to me. And then there's maybe one that Paul has set up and it looks like a mobile phone shop where there's a bunch of young people sitting around with their headphones in talking about stuff, whatever, and I don't really want to go in there either. And then look at the one that Mark from County Down set up and it looks quite highbrow and whatever. And I think, oh yeah, I quite like it in there. So I go into Mark's shop and buy the same product that Paul and Amy are selling as well. But the presentation of that group suits me. I prefer it. It's to my taste. Maybe there's a bunch of young people attending the one that Lisa sets up, and somebody younger than me may well want to go there. But we're all doing the same thing. We're all unifying around the program of recovery, because what we're looking for is unity, not uniformity. And that's why I'm starting to change my tune slightly on my McDonald's analogy, because although I have no opinion on McDonald's, good or bad, the point I was trying to make before is their franchise model works really well. You can get the same product in both places. And I stick by that example to talk about how tightly we should look at Tradition 1 unifying around the program of recovery, but Tradition 4 gives us the flexibility to be different. But it's not autonomy in the sense that it gives us the flexibility to be different to the extent that we decide just not to bother doing the freaking thing. This just jack it in altogether and not unify around the program of recovery and do something else. That's not what it means. So Belfast Recover Group has decided it will have 3 meetings at 6:30 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. In those meetings at 6:30 a.m., you will have an informed lead talking about a section of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And then it's opening up for sharing. So in that meeting, we are unifying around the program of recovery. On the Tuesday night meeting, you have a slightly different format, and that is a big book study around the program of recovery. Now, somebody else down the road may well have a speaker meeting. We used to have a speaker meeting on a Saturday night, but any speakers who were invited were first of all quizzed. Have you had a spiritual awakening as a result of working the 12 steps? Did you do that by working the program of recovery as outlined in the book Alcoholics Anonymous? Are you coming here to talk about that? Are you coming here to do a drink-along? Because that's not welcome. That's not what we do here. And we were able to change the format and to use the autonomy of Tradition 4, but to still unify around the program of recovery. So we were different to the other guy, and the other guy was different to us, and the third guy was different again, consistent. And if somebody walked into one of our meetings or somebody walked into the other guy's meetings, they were still getting the program of recovery, but we are autonomous. We are different. Why? What can we bring? What can we do that's different, and how can we word that? Well, the terminology that's used in the AA illustrated pamphlet that I quite like is customs. We have different customs that we would bring in. Like, we don't have a physical meeting, we just have our meetings online. That is the custom of this group. It's not a different tradition, we just have a different way of doing it to the other guy. So that's the first part of Tradition 4, and I guess where it becomes contradictory if misread is the other part. So, all right, I'm going to repeat what I just said, and I'm going to read something out to you, and then you're going to give me a couple of minutes just to explain it, because it's going to sound like that doesn't make any sense. So we can't do whatever the hell we want, because what we have to do is hold ourselves accountable to Tradition 1. We unify around the program of recovery, but we do it with our own accent, our own flavor, our own angle. And that's the part where we're entitled to be autonomous. But then how does that make sense if you were to read this from that same Grapevine magazine article, where it says, with these concepts in mind, let us look more closely at Tradition 4, the concepts being the specific application of the general principles of 1 and 2. The first sentence of Tradition 4 guarantees each AA group local autonomy. With respect to its own affairs, the group may make any decisions, adopt any attitude it likes. It may do whatever the hell it likes. It's not what it says, essentially, but it may adopt any attitude it likes. No overall or intergroup authority should challenge this primary privilege. We feel this ought to be so, even though the group might sometimes act with complete indifference to our traditions. How does that make sense? You know, how does that make sense within the traditions that says we can act with complete indifference to our traditions? How does that make sense whenever I've just said that that's not what it doesn't mean? Well, bring this back to the fact that it's the specific applications of Tradition 1 and 2. Tradition 1 talks about how we unify around the program of recovery, but Tradition 2 talks about what way the authority sits. Now, what it goes on to say helps to explain this a wee bit further, and I will summarize this at the end because I'm very aware of the fact that it does get quite confusing. What it goes on to say then is this. For example, an AA group could, if it wished, hire a paid preacher and support him out of the proceeds of a group nightclub. Though such an absurd procedure would be miles outside our tradition, the group's right to be wrong should be held inviolate. We are sure that each group can be granted and safely granted these most extreme privileges. We know that our familiar process of trial and error will similarly eliminate both the preacher and the nightclub. Those severe growing pains which invariably follow any radical departure from AA tradition can be absolutely relied upon to bring an erring group back into line. An AA group need not be coerced by any human government over and above its own members. Their own experience plus AA opinion in surrounding groups plus God's prompting in their group conscience would be sufficient. Much travail has already taught us this. Hence, we may confidently say to each group, you should be responsible to no other authority than your own conscience. Okay, what's going on here? So let's just have a bit of a reminder of what the group structure looks like in Alcoholics Anonymous. And this little graphic here might help to bring this back into our memories. So that's the service structure of Alcoholics Anonymous in Ireland. It's the same everywhere. They just call these different tiers different names in some areas, but we have the groups, and then below that we have the areas, then we have the intergroups, then we have the General Service Conference. So at the top of this inverted triangle, you have the groups. So what if the groups are misbehaving? What if the groups are running a nightclub and generating loads of money and then paying a non-alcoholic preacher to come in and talk at their meetings? That violates every one of our traditions. What are they doing that? Well, what authority is there above them? What tier is there above them to report them to? There isn't one. There isn't one. So what we have here is the group's right to be wrong because there is no authority above the group. You can't bring it to intergroup. That's like going down a tier. And this is something massively misunderstood in the service structure in Ireland. And certainly whenever there was some folks in the service structure had a problem with our group and seemed to consistently have a problem with our group, they talked about reporting us to intergroup. And I said at one of these meetings, you guys are a bit like husband and wife that don't get on, and then you want to report it to the children. And if the children don't satisfy your answer, you then want to bring it to the dog. None of this makes any sense. So the groups are not permitted to do whatever the hell they want. But in the event that they do whatever the hell they want, there is no authority can prevent them from doing that other than their own conscience. Now, I say all this in the context of the time at which it was written, which is that everybody is endeavoring to follow the principles, endeavoring to follow the traditions, looking at them, reading them. Maybe they've misread them and gone way off track. Now, what we have is people that don't even read the bastards. So I don't know what to say about that, because that's just people who are so way off that none of this makes any sense because they're not well informed. But in the event that a group goes way off, what happens? Well, the group revolts. Somebody in the group will say, hang on a second here, what do you mean a paid preacher? That's a violation of Tradition 7 and various other ones. What do you mean about bringing someone who's not an alcoholic in? What about Tradition 11? What about expressing opinions and outside matters in Tradition 10? And then the group itself will stop it from happening. That's what this means. That's what this is referring to. So what you have within Tradition 4 is, first of all, the group is autonomous to come up with its own application of Tradition 1. It cannot veto Tradition 1, but it has its own application on it. So the way in which the message is carried in this group might be slightly different to the way that the message is carried in the other group, but in both groups, the message is the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the event that the group goes off, there is no authority can police it. There is no AA police. There is no governing body. The members of the group itself, within their own conscience, will hold themselves accountable to that. Do you remember in Tradition 2, we talked about a well-informed group conscience? If you don't have people in your group who understand the traditions, you haven't got a fucking AA group because it's not well-informed. That's just a mess. So everything that I'm saying has to be held in the context of this being done right, and as having people in the groups who bother to read the material, because then we will hold ourselves accountable. The other point that it refers to in Tradition 4 is actions that may affect AA in the whole or affecting neighbouring groups. So, we don't have the right to do things that are going to affect our neighbours. And an example of that, whenever we expanded the online facility, there was other groups had adopted online facilities at that time, and the times of the day and week that we wished to set up our additional meetings were at the same time as other groups in Belfast. So what we did there is we wrote out to those groups. We wrote out to 12 groups for to say in relation to Tradition 4, this is our observation, and, we want to enter into dialogue with you to ensure that we're not affecting your group, but this are the intentions that we're hoping for our own group, whatever. 8 of the groups didn't respond to us. 3 of them entered into dialogue with us, and 1 of them wrote back saying, I've no idea what you're talking about. So from the 3 that you understood what we meant, they entered into dialogue with us. We changed some of our meetings, they changed some of their meetings, and in 1 we agreed that it would be fine for both those meetings to happen at the same time. So if we're going to do something that affects a neighbouring group, this be good neighbours, this exercise of courtesy that Tradition 4 would have us show. All right, so tradition four is not really as confusing as it looks, but I can see how someone might disagree. I can't even wait to see what the questions are going to be like this week. But essentially, what we have, tradition four, is not a veto. It is not a permission to violate the rest of the traditions. But if you do that, by virtue of a right to be wrong, nobody can stop you as a group. The right to be wrong is so important because a governing body would be more damaging. But whenever you have a well-informed group conscience, like tradition two would have you have, your right to be wrong will not last particularly long because your own group will recognize that and will put a stop to it and we all move on. Such is the intention. And if we enter into any kind of behaviours that may well affect a neighbouring group, let's have a chat with them. Let's see if we can work it out. That's my summary of tradition four, Chris. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so very, very much, Brian. I've got a wee script here. I'm just going to pause the recording. Rolling start.